The Thanksgiving dinner that nearly killed me started like any other family gathering, but by Christmas, I had the security footage that would destroy my mother-in-law forever. What she didn't know was that her attempt to poison me would become the very weapon I'd use to claim my rightful place in this family. The November air carried the scent of burning leaves and anticipation as I pulled into the circular driveway of the Whitmore estate. The sprawling Tudor-style mansion stood like a fortress against the gray Connecticut sky, its ivy-covered walls hiding decades of family secrets that I was only beginning to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This would be my third Thanksgiving with my husband Corey's family, and despite the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, I had hoped this year might be different. I was wrong. Rosemarie Whitmore had made it clear from the moment I married her son that I would never truly belong in their world. The daughter of a small-town mechanic didn't fit the aristocratic image she had carefully cultivated for the Whitmore name. Every family gathering was a masterclass in passive aggression where she wielded her silver tongue like a scalpel, making precise cuts designed to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. But I had learned to endure. I had learned to smile through her backhanded compliments about my quaint background, to laugh politely when she introduced me to her friends as Corey's little wife from… where was it again? I had convinced myself that patience and kindness would eventually win her over, that maternal instinct would triumph over class prejudice. How naive I had been. Corey carried our contribution to dinner, a homemade sweet potato casserole that had taken me 3 attempts to perfect, while I smoothed down my burgundy dress, the most expensive thing in my wardrobe. Rosemarie had made pointed comments about appropriate attire at previous gatherings, and I refused to give her ammunition this time. The front door opened before we could knock, revealing Scarlett, Corey's younger sister, her platinum blonde, hair swept into an elegant chignon that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile was bright, but didn't reach her eyes, a trait she shared with her mother. "Well, look who finally made it," she said, air-kissing my cheeks with practiced precision. "Mother was beginning to worry you'd gotten lost on the way from wherever it is you live now." The subtle dig wasn't lost on me. Our modest 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford was a 40-minute drive from the estate, hardly an unreasonable distance, but in Scarlett's world, anything outside their exclusive zip code might as well have been Mars. "Traffic was lighter than expected," I replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. 3 years of marriage had taught me that reaction was exactly what they wanted, proof that I was the unstable, emotional outsider who didn't belong in their refined circle. The interior of the house was exactly as I remembered. Museum-quality furniture arranged with mathematical precision, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across Persian rugs that were probably worth more than most people's cars. Everything was beautiful, cold, and utterly intimidating, much like the woman who ruled over it all. Rosemarie emerged from the dining room like a queen holding court, her silver hair styled in an impeccable bob, her black Chanel suit sharp enough to cut glass. At 63, she was still a formidable presence, her posture military straight, her pale blue eyes missing nothing as they swept over my appearance with surgical precision. "Jane, darling," she said, extending her hand as if I were a visiting dignitary rather than her daughter-in-law. "How lovely that you could join us. I do hope you haven't brought any of those creative interpretations of traditional recipes." The comment was delivered with such honey-sweet venom that it took me a moment to process the insult. Last year, my attempt to contribute pumpkin bread had been met with raised eyebrows and whispered comments about store-bought taste. This year's sweet potato casserole was made entirely from scratch, following a recipe that had been in my family for generations. "Just sweet potato casserole," I said, holding up the dish. "My grandmother's recipe." "How authentic," Rosemarie replied, the word dripping with condescension. Well, we'll certainly find somewhere to put it. Corey, ever the peacekeeper, jumped in before the tension could escalate further. Where's Dad? And Uncle Pete? Your father is in his study, pretending to work but actually hiding from the festivities, Rosemarie said with a slight smile that suggested this was an annual tradition. And Pete should be here any moment with Nicole and the boys. As if summoned by her words, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. Moments later, Pete Whitmore burst through the front door with the energy of a man half his age, his booming laugh filling the foyer. Behind him came his wife Nicole, a nervous sparrow of a woman who always looked like she was apologizing for existing, followed by their twin sons Lionel and Jansen, both 17 and radiating the particular brand of arrogance that came from knowing they would inherit wealth they had never worked for. The party can officially start now, Pete announced, sweeping Rosemarie into an embrace that she tolerated rather than returned. Something smells incredible in here. Cook has outdone herself this year, Rosemarie replied, smoothly taking credit for work she hadn't done. Shall we move to the living room for cocktails before dinner? The living room was a shrine to Whitmore family achievement. Oil paintings of long-dead ancestors, awards from Corey's father's banking career, photographs of family vacations to places most people only saw in travel magazines. I perched on the edge of an antique settee, nursing a glass of wine and trying to blend into the expensive wallpaper while the family caught up on gossip about people I would never meet. It was during this pre-dinner ritual that I first noticed Rosemarie watching me with unusual intensity. Not the typical disapproving glances I had grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more calculated. Her pale eyes tracked my movements with predatory focus, as if she were studying prey before a strike. When Cook announced that dinner was served, we filed into the dining room like soldiers reporting for duty. The table was set with china, so delicate. It looked like it might shatter if you breathed on it too hard. Crystal goblets that caught the light from the chandelier overhead, and enough silverware to outfit a small restaurant. I found myself seated between Corey and Jansen, directly, across from Rosemarie, who presided over the table like a benevolent dictator. The irony of that placement would become clear later, close enough for her to watch every bite I took, every sip I drank, every moment of what she had planned to be my last meal. The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to. Mutual friends from their exclusive social circle. Business dealings I didn't understand. Plans for holiday parties I wouldn't be invited to. I smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, played the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law who knew her place. But something felt different this year. There was an undercurrent of anticipation in the room, a tension that had nothing to do with the usual family dynamics. Rosemarie's attention kept returning to me throughout the meal, her smile too bright, her questions too pointed. "Jane, dear, you've barely touched your wine," she observed as Cook cleared the main course. "It's a 1998 Bordeaux, quite special. Lionel, be a darling and refresh Jane's glass." I hadn't realized my glass was nearly empty. The wine had been exceptional, smooth and rich, with a slightly bitter aftertaste that I attributed to its complexity. But as Lionel poured another generous serving, I noticed Rosemarie's satisfied smile, the way her fingers drummed once against the table in what looked almost like victory. That should have been my first warning. But hindsight is always clearer than the moment itself, and in that moment, I was still the naive woman who believed that kindness could overcome cruelty, that patience would eventually be rewarded. I had no idea that the bitter aftertaste in my wine wasn't sophisticated tannins. It was the first hint of the poison that would nearly kill me, and ultimately give me the power to destroy the woman who had underestimated me one final time. The poisoning began so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. What I initially dismissed as rich food, disagreeing with my system, became something far more sinister as the evening progressed. But Rosemarie's careful orchestration was masterful in its execution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After dinner, we moved to the Grand Salon for what Rosemarie called digestives and civilized conversation. The room was her domain entirely, decorated in shades of cream and gold that complemented her coloring perfectly, with strategically placed family portraits that told the story of Whitmore's superiority spanning 4 generations. I had always felt like an intruder in this space, perched uncomfortably on furniture that cost more than most people's cars, while conversations swirled around me in coded language I was never meant to understand. "Jane looks a bit piqued," Scarlett observed, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound genuine to the others, while her eyes glittered with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. Perhaps the wine was a bit strong for someone unaccustomed to vintage selections. The comment hit its mark perfectly. I did feel off. A strange combination of nausea and dizziness that I attributed to nerves and the overwhelming richness of the meal. My hands felt clammy, and there was an odd metallic taste in my mouth that I couldn't quite place. "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice sounded thin even to my own ears. "Just tired from the drive." Rosemarie leaned forward with what appeared to be maternal concern, though her pale eyes remained calculating. "Nonsense. Dear, you look positively green around the gills. Perhaps you should lie down for a moment. The blue guest room is always prepared." It was then that I noticed the careful choreography of their concern. Pete's wife, Nicole, usually invisible in family gatherings, was suddenly attentive, offering to help me upstairs. Lionel appeared with a glass of water before I even realized I was thirsty. Even Corey's father, who had emerged from his study for dinner but typically retreated immediately afterward, lingered in the doorway watching the scene unfold. They were all waiting for something. "Actually, fresh air might help more," I said, fighting against the growing fog in my head. Something primitive in my brain was sending alarm signals, though I couldn't yet understand why. Maybe I could step onto the terrace for a moment? The suggestion created a ripple of tension so subtle that anyone not trained to read this family's micro-expressions would have missed it entirely. Rosemarie's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Scarlett's fingers drummed once against her brandy snifter. Even young Jansen, typically absorbed in his phone, looked up with sudden interest. "Oh, I don't think that's wise," Rosemarie said, quickly. "It's quite cold outside and in your condition." "Well, we wouldn't want you to catch your death of cold, would we?" The phrase hit my ears with strange emphasis, as if she were savoring the words. "Catch your death." The casual way she said it sent an unexpected chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Mother's right," Corey agreed, though he seemed genuinely concerned rather than calculating. "You should rest. We can head home early if you're not feeling well." But Rosemarie was already rising from her chair with fluid grace, moving toward me with the purposeful stride of a woman accustomed to having her suggestions treated as commands. "Absolutely not. Jane is family, and family takes care of family. I insist she rest here until she feels better. The blue guest room has that lovely view of the gardens, and it's so peaceful. You'll feel refreshed in no time." The insistence felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave, to get out of this house and away from Rosemarie's suddenly solicitous attention, but my head was growing foggier by the moment. The metallic taste was stronger now, accompanied by a strange numbness in my fingertips that I tried to hide by clasping my hands together. "I really think I should go home," I said, attempting to stand. The room tilted slightly, and I had to grip the arm of my chair to steady myself. "Absolutely not," Rosemarie repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "Look at you, dear. You can barely stand. Pete, help Jane to the guest room. Nicole, perhaps you could bring her some chamomile tea? It's so soothing for the stomach." The orchestration was becoming clearer now, though my increasingly muddled thoughts struggled to process the implications. Everyone had a role to play in ensuring I stayed in this house, in this room, drinking whatever soothing remedy Rosemarie prescribed. Everyone except Corey, who seemed genuinely torn between his concern for me and his lifelong habit of deferring to his mother's judgment. "Maybe we should call a doctor," he suggested hesitantly. "If Jane's really feeling that unwell." "Don't be ridiculous," Rosemarie snapped, the first crack in her concerned facade. "It's clearly just something she ate. Food poisoning, perhaps, though I can't imagine how since we all ate the same meal." She let the implication hang in the air, that somehow my inferior constitution couldn't handle the quality of food served at the Whitmore table. But I had eaten the same meal as everyone else, hadn't I? My foggy brain tried to reconstruct the evening, the wine. She had insisted I drink more wine, the special vintage that Lionel had poured with such careful attention. The wine that had tasted so sophisticated, so complex, with that bitter aftertaste I had attributed to expensive tannins. "The wine," I mumbled, more to myself than to anyone else. But Rosemarie's sharp hearing caught every word. "What about the wine, dear?" Her voice was honey-sweet again, but there was steel underneath now. It tasted different, bitter. I was struggling to form coherent thoughts, let alone sentences, but some survival instinct was pushing me to understand what was happening to me. Scarlett laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Well, of course it did. It's a 1998 Bordeaux, not some cheap grocery store swill. I suppose someone with your background wouldn't be accustomed to wines with such complexity." The insult rolled, off me without impact. I was beyond caring about their casual cruelty now, focused entirely on the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The numbness in my hands was spreading up my arms, and my vision was starting to blur around the edges. "I need to go home," I said again, this time with more force than I felt capable of mustering. "Corey, please, I need to go home now." But when I looked around for my husband, I found him deep in conversation with his Uncle Pete, apparently oblivious to my distress. The conversation appeared to be about business, something about quarterly reports and market projections that would normally bore me to tears, but now seemed like a deliberate distraction. Rosemarie followed my gaze and smiled that predatory smile I was beginning to recognize. Men and their business talk. They get so absorbed, don't they? "Come now, Jane. Let's get you settled upstairs where you can rest properly." Her hand was on my elbow before I could protest, guiding me toward the hallway with surprising strength for a woman her age. The pressure of her fingers felt possessive, controlling, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I felt genuine fear of my mother-in-law. As we reached the bottom of the grand staircase, I made one last attempt to assert control over the situation. "I'm going to be sick," I announced, hoping the threat of vomiting on her precious Persian rugs would buy me some space to think clearly. Instead, Rosemarie's grip tightened on my arm. "All the more reason to get you upstairs quickly, dear. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself in front of the family, would we?" The way she said it, with such casual malice, finally penetrated the fog that was clouding my judgment. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family taking care of family. This was something else entirely, something calculated and cold and utterly ruthless. As Rosemarie guided me up the stairs toward the blue guest room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was pale, my pupils dilated, and there was a sheen of perspiration on my forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature in the house. I looked like someone who had been poisoned, and Rosemarie Whitmore looked like someone who was very pleased with her handiwork. The blue guest room was a masterpiece of subtle imprisonment. Rosemarie had chosen it carefully, far from the main areas of the house, with windows that overlooked the back gardens rather than the driveway where someone might notice unusual activity. The room was decorated in soothing pastels that would have been calming under normal circumstances, but now felt like the walls of a beautifully appointed tomb. As Pete helped me to the four-poster bed, his hands were surprisingly gentle, though I caught him exchanging a meaningful look with Rosemarie. Over my head. Whatever was happening here, he was part of it, though whether willingly or under his sister-in-law's considerable influence, I couldn't yet determine. There now, Rosemarie cooed, plumping pillows behind my back with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. Much better. Nicole should be up with that tea shortly. The mention of tea sent another wave of alarm through my increasingly foggy consciousness. More liquid to consume, more opportunities for whatever was affecting me to worsen. I had to find a way to avoid drinking anything else, but my options were limited when I could barely keep my head upright. I don't think I want tea, I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. Maybe just water? Rosemarie's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her pale eyes. Nonsense, dear. Chamomile tea is exactly what you need. It settles the stomach and helps with whatever seems to be troubling you. The emphasis on whatever wasn't lost on me, even in my compromised state. She knew exactly what was troubling me because she had caused it. But acknowledging that reality would mean admitting that my mother-in-law, a pillar of Connecticut society, a woman who hosted charity luncheons and served on museum boards, was capable of attempted murder. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Nicole entered carrying a delicate china teacup on a silver tray, her movements hesitant and her eyes carefully avoiding mine. She had always been the most nervous member of the family, but tonight her anxiety seemed particularly pronounced. Here we are, she said softly, setting the tray on the bedside table. Fresh chamomile tea. It should help you feel better. I studied Nicole's face as she spoke, searching for any sign of complicity or guilt. What I found instead was fear. Not fear of me, but fear of something else entirely. Her hands shook slightly as she arranged the tray, and she kept glancing toward Rosemarie as if seeking approval for her every movement. Thank you, Nicole, Rosemarie said smoothly. I'm sure Jane appreciates your thoughtfulness. Don't you, dear? The question was clearly a command, but it also gave me an unexpected opportunity. If I was going to survive whatever Rosemarie had planned, I needed to start thinking strategically rather than simply reacting to each new development. Actually, I said, forcing my voice to sound stronger than I felt, I wonder if Corey could come up. I'd feel better if he were here. Rosemarie's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Of course, darling. Though he's rather absorbed in business talk with the men, you know how these things go. Once they start discussing markets and investments, the rest of the world simply disappears. It was a dismissal disguised as an explanation, but it told me something important. Corey's absence wasn't accidental. Rosemarie had orchestrated the evening to ensure that her son would be distracted when his wife needed him most. Still, I persisted, I'd really like to see him. Maybe Nicole could ask him to come up? Nicole looked between me and Rosemarie like a tennis spectator, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of this polite battle of wills. After a moment's hesitation, she started toward the door, but Rosemarie's voice stopped her. That won't be necessary, Rosemarie said, her tone brooking no argument. Jane needs rest more than conversation. Corey can check on her later, once she's had time to recover. The casual way she dismissed my request, and Nicole's automatic compliance, crystallized something in my mind. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about power, control, and the systematic erosion of my autonomy within this family. Rosemarie had been orchestrating my isolation for years, and tonight was simply the culmination of a much longer campaign. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated my capacity for survival. The tea smells lovely, I said, reaching for the cup with deliberately shaky hands. But I'm afraid I might spill it. Could you help me? It was a calculated risk, but one that paid off immediately. Rosemary's eagerness to ensure I consumed, the tea overcame her usual reluctance to perform menial tasks. She moved closer to the bed, her attention focused entirely on the cup in my hands. As she leaned forward to steady the teacup, I let my other hand fall naturally to my side, where my fingers found the call button for the house's intercom system. The button was nearly flush with the wooden frame of the bed, easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. I had discovered it during a previous stay in this room, when Corey and I had visited for his father's birthday. With what I hoped appeared to be an involuntary tremor, I pressed the button. The intercom system was connected to every room in the house, including Corey's father's study where the men were presumably discussing business. If my timing was right, and if I could manage to say the right words at the right moment, I might be able to alert someone to my situation without Rosemarie realizing what I had done. "I'm feeling quite dizzy," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough to carry through the intercom while still sounding weak and confused. "Rosemarie, what was in that wine at dinner? The 1998 Bordeaux that Lionel served me? It tasted so strange, so bitter." Rosemarie's hands stilled on the teacup, and I saw the exact moment she realized what I was doing. Her pale eyes flashed with something that might have been respect or might have been rage, possibly both. "You're confused, dear," she said, carefully, her voice pitched to carry the same authority it always held. "The wine was perfectly normal. You're simply having a reaction to something you ate." But I pressed on, gambling everything on this one desperate play. "It's just that the metallic taste started right after the wine, and now I can barely feel my hands. Corey always says I should trust my instincts, and my instincts are telling me something is very wrong." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. I could hear Rosemarie's breathing, could see the calculations running behind her eyes as she weighed her options. Nicole had gone completely still by the door, apparently frozen by the sudden shift in the room's dynamic. Then, from somewhere in the house, I heard the sound of rapid footsteps in the hallway. Rosemarie heard them too. Her grip on the teacup tightened, and for a moment I thought she might force the liquid down my throat regardless of the consequences. But the footsteps were getting closer, and she was too smart to risk being caught in such a compromising position. Instead, she set the cup down on the bedside table and straightened, her composure sliding back into place like armor. "Perhaps you should rest now, Jane. We can discuss your concerns when you're feeling more yourself." The threat in her voice was unmistakable, but so was the acknowledgement that our game had changed. I had managed to signal for help and force her to retreat, at least temporarily. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. As the footsteps reached the guest room door, I caught Rosemarie's eye and smiled. Not the weak, grateful smile of a victim, but something harder and more knowing. She had made her move, and I had countered it. Now we would see who was really the stronger player in this deadly game of family politics. The footsteps in the hallway belonged to Corey, but he wasn't alone. I could hear his father's deeper voice and the lighter tones of what sounded like Jansen asking questions. My desperate gambit with the intercom had worked better than I'd dared hope. The entire male contingent of the family was now aware that something was wrong with Jane in the blue guest room. "Jane?" Corey's voice carried genuine concern as he appeared in the doorway. His tie loosened, and his face flushed from what had probably been several glasses of his father's expensive whiskey. "Mom said you weren't feeling well, but when we heard you, over the intercom..." Rosemarie stepped smoothly between us, her posture radiating maternal authority. "She's been quite confused, darling, talking about the wine tasting bitter, imaging all sorts of things. I think the rich food simply overwhelmed her system." But Corey's eyes were on me now, studying my face with the attention of someone who had lived with me for 3 years and knew when something was genuinely wrong. "You look terrible," he said bluntly. "Your pupils are huge, and you're sweating." "I've been trying to tell them," I said, making my voice as clear and rational as possible despite the fog still clouding my thoughts. Something's wrong with me. Corey. I started feeling sick right after dinner, and it's getting worse. Behind Corey, his father appeared, a distinguished man in his 70s who had built the Whitmore banking empire through careful observation and strategic thinking. His sharp gray eyes took in the scene with the analytical precision that had made him millions, noting Rosemarie's defensive posture, Nicole's nervous fidgeting by the window, and my obvious distress. "What exactly are you experiencing, Jane?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to difficult questions. Rosemarie opened her mouth to respond, but her husband held up a hand to silence her. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. He wanted to hear from me directly. "Nausea, dizziness, numbness in my hands and arms," I recited, grateful for his intervention. "A metallic taste in my mouth that started after the wine. And I'm having trouble thinking clearly. Everything feels foggy." The symptoms painted a clear picture to anyone with medical knowledge, but Rosemarie was quick to offer an alternative explanation. "Food poisoning," she said dismissively. "Though I can't imagine how, since we all ate the same meal. Perhaps her constitution simply isn't as robust as ours." The subtle insult was perfectly delivered, designed to make me seem fragile and unreliable, while simultaneously deflecting attention from the real cause of my symptoms. But Corey's father wasn't buying it. "If we all ate the same meal, then why is Jane the only one affected?" he asked pointedly. "What did she have that the rest of us didn't?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Rosemarie's composure flickered for just a moment, but it was enough. She had been caught in a logical inconsistency, and everyone in the room could sense it. "Well," she began, her voice slightly less certain than usual. "She did have rather more wine than usual, perhaps." "The 1998 Bordeaux," I interrupted, seizing the opening she had inadvertently provided. "Lionel poured it for me specifically. Rosemarie insisted I drink more because it was such a special vintage." Young Jansen, who had been quiet until now, spoke up from the doorway. "Wait, didn't grandmother ask me to open that bottle earlier, before dinner? She said it needed to breathe, but that seemed weird because red wine usually only needs like 30 minutes, not 3 hours. The innocent observation from the 17-year-old hit Rosemarie like a physical blow. I could see her mind racing, trying to formulate an explanation that would account for why she had opened the wine so far in advance. Plenty of time. To doctor it with whatever substance was now coursing through my system, I wanted to make sure it was perfect, she said quickly. Sometimes older wines can be unpredictable, and I thought the extra time would help. But the damage was done. Corey's father was now looking at his wife with the same analytical intensity he usually reserved for business negotiations. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense the wheels turning behind his gray eyes. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should call Dr. Morrison, just to be safe." The suggestion sent a visible jolt through Rosemarie. Dr. Morrison was the family physician, a discreet man who had treated the Whitmores for decades. He would also be able to identify exactly what was in my system, something Rosemarie clearly couldn't afford. "That's hardly necessary," she protested. "It's just food poisoning. She'll feel better in the morning." "If it's just food poisoning, then Dr. Morrison can confirm that and give her something to help," Corey said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling him." Rosemarie's mask of concerned mother-in-law finally began to slip entirely. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, her voice carrying an edge of desperation I had never heard before. "Waking poor Dr. Morrison on Thanksgiving evening for a simple case of indigestion? What will he think of us?" The appeal to social propriety was vintage Rosemarie, but it fell flat in the face of the mounting evidence. Even Nicole, usually Rosemarie's most reliable ally through sheer intimidation, was beginning to look uncomfortable with the situation. "I think we should call him too," Nicole said quietly, surprising everyone in the room. "Jane really doesn't look well, and if there's something seriously wrong." Rosemary whirled on her daughter-in-law with fury that made her previous coldness seem warm by comparison. "Don't you dare tell me how to handle this situation," she hissed. "I've been managing this family's medical needs since before you were born." The vicious response was a tactical error of the highest order. It revealed the desperation beneath Rosemary's carefully constructed facade and made it clear that she was more concerned with maintaining control than with my well-being. Corey's father stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. "Rosemary," he said simply, "sit down." It wasn't a request. The two words carried the weight of decades of marriage and the implicit threat of consequences that would extend far beyond this single evening. Rosemary hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between her need to control the situation and her ingrained habit of deferring to her husband's authority. She sat. "Corey," his father continued without taking his eyes off his wife, "call Dr. Morrison. Tell him we have a potential poisoning case and need him here immediately." The word poisoning hung in the air like an accusation. Rosemary's face went white, but she didn't protest. She couldn't, not without confirming what everyone in the room was beginning to suspect. As Corey dialed the doctor's number, I caught Rosemary's eye across the room. What I saw there was no longer the confident superiority I had endured for 3 years. Instead, I saw fear, and for the first time since I had married into this family, she was the one who was afraid of me. The psychological warfare had begun, and I had just landed the first real blow. But I knew Rosemary well enough to understand that cornering her would only make her more dangerous. She was like a wounded animal now, desperate and unpredictable. Whatever came next would test both our limits. I just had to survive long enough to see how this deadly game would end. Dr. Morrison arrived within 30 minutes, his silver hair disheveled and his usually impeccable appearance slightly rumpled, from being summoned on a holiday evening. He was a man in his 60s who had served as the Whitmore family physician for over 2 decades, discreet and professional, with the kind of bedside manner that came from treating society families who valued privacy above all else. But tonight, his usual calm demeanor carried an edge of concern as he took in my condition. The numbness had spread further up my arms, and my vision was becoming increasingly blurry around the edges. Whatever Rosemary had given me was reaching peak effectiveness, and we were running out of time. "How long has she been experiencing these symptoms?" Dr. Morrison asked, setting his medical bag on the bedside table and pulling out a small flashlight to examine my pupils. "Since shortly after dinner," Corey answered before Rosemary could respond. "She started feeling sick during our after-dinner drinks." Dr. Morrison nodded, his expression growing more serious as he noted my dilated pupils and checked my pulse. "Rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, profuse sweating despite normal room temperature," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Jane, can you tell me exactly what you ate and drank this evening?" Rosemary started to speak, but Dr. Morrison held up a hand without looking at her. "I need to hear from the patient directly, please." The simple request carried the weight of medical authority, and even Rosemary couldn't argue with it. I could see her jaw clench as she was forced to remain silent while I recounted the evening's events. "The same meal as everyone else," I said, my words slightly slurred despite my efforts to speak clearly. "But I had wine that was different." Rosemary insisted I drink the 1998 Bordeaux. It had a bitter aftertaste that I thought was just sophisticated. Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bitter aftertaste in wine can sometimes indicate contamination," he said carefully. "Or adulteration." The clinical term hung in the air like an accusation. Rosemary's face had gone completely pale, but she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating high society politics. "That's impossible," she said smoothly. "The wine was from our private cellar. I opened it myself to let it breathe." "How long before dinner did you open it?" Dr. Morrison asked, and I could hear the subtle interrogation beginning. Several hours, Rosemarie admitted reluctantly. I wanted to make sure it was perfect. Dr. Morrison made a note in his small leather notebook. And during those several hours, where was the wine stored? In the kitchen, naturally. On the counter. Accessible to others in the household? Rosemarie's composure cracked slightly. Are you suggesting that someone tampered with our wine? That's absurd. This is a respectable home, not some den of criminals. But Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. Jane, I'm going to need to take some blood samples for testing. Based on your symptoms, I suspect you may have ingested something that doesn't belong in wine. The word ingested was carefully chosen, clinical enough to sound professional, but clear enough that everyone in the room understood its implications. Someone had deliberately given me a substance that was making me seriously ill. That won't be necessary, Rosemarie said quickly. She's obviously just having a reaction to rich food and alcohol. Some people simply can't handle. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had dealt with difficult family members before. Your daughter-in-law is showing clear signs of poisoning. Without proper testing and treatment, she could face serious complications. The word poisoning was finally spoken aloud by a medical professional, and its impact was immediate. Corey went white. His father's expression hardened, and even the twins, who had been hovering in the doorway, looked shocked. But it was Nicole's reaction that surprised me most. She let out a small gasp and covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with what looked like guilty knowledge. Rosemarie noticed her daughter-in-law's reaction immediately. Nicole, she said sharply, perhaps you should go downstairs and make some coffee for Dr. Morrison. It was clearly a dismissal, an attempt to remove Nicole from the room before she could say something incriminating. But Nicole didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at me with an expression that might have been apology or regret. I saw her, Nicole said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The room went completely silent. Even Dr. Morrison stopped his preparations to look at her. Saw. Who do what? Corey's father asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Nicole's hands were shaking now, and she kept glancing between me and Rosemarie as if she were watching a tennis match where lives hung in the balance. I saw Rosemarie in the kitchen earlier, before dinner. She was doing something to the wine bottle. Rosemarie's mask of civilized concern finally shattered completely. Don't you dare, she hissed at Nicole, all pretense of maternal warmth gone. Don't you dare spread lies about me in my own home. But Nicole had found her courage, perhaps motivated by the sight of me lying there obviously poisoned while Rosemarie continued to deny responsibility. She had a small bottle, Nicole continued, her voice growing stronger. Something from her purse. She poured it into the wine and stirred it with one of the silver spoons. Dr. Morrison set down his stethoscope and looked directly at Rosemarie. Mrs. Whitmore, what did you put in that wine? Nothing, Rosemarie snapped, but her voice carried a note of hysteria now. Nicole is obviously confused. She's been drinking herself this evening and— I haven't had a drop, Nicole interrupted, surprising everyone with her newfound assertiveness. I've been too nervous about dinner to drink anything, and I know what I saw. Corey stepped forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. Mom, what did you do? Rosemarie looked around the room at the circle of accusatory faces, her husband, her son, her daughter-in-law, the family doctor, and me. For the first time in the 3 years I had known her, she was completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered. She doesn't belong here, Rosemarie said suddenly, her voice raw with emotion. She never belonged here. You married beneath yourself, Corey, and I won't stand by and watch this family's reputation be destroyed by some nobody from Hartford. The confession wasn't complete, but it was enough. She had admitted to deliberately targeting me, and her motive was clear. Class prejudice, taken to its logical, deadly extreme. Dr. Morrison was already drawing blood from my arm, his movements efficient and professional. "We'll know exactly what she ingested within hours," he said. "And I'm obligated to report suspected poisoning cases to the authorities." The word authorities hit Rosemary like a physical blow. Her world of country clubs and charity galas, of carefully maintained social standing and generational wealth, was about to collide with the harsh reality of criminal investigation. But even as the room spun around me and my vision continued to blur, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years of marriage: power. Rosemarie had overplayed her hand, revealed her true nature, and in doing so had given me everything I needed to destroy her. The seeds of doubt she had tried to plant about my worthiness had taken root, but not in the way she had intended. Instead, they had grown into questions about her own character, her own fitness to be the matriarch of this family. As Dr. Morrison finished taking my blood samples and began preparing medications to counteract whatever poison was in my system, I caught Rosemarie's eye one last time. She had taught me well over the years how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment, how to use an opponent's arrogance against them. Now I was going to put those lessons to good use. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The following weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Rosemarie had been arrested on Thanksgiving night, charged with attempted murder after the blood tests revealed a cocktail of prescription medications that could have killed me in higher doses. The local newspapers had a field day with the story. "Society matriarch attempts to poison daughter-in-law," the headline screamed, accompanied by unflattering photographs of Rosemarie being led away in handcuffs. But Rosemarie Whitmore was nothing if not resourceful. Within 48 hours, she had hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney in Connecticut, posted bail that amounted to more than most people's annual salaries, and begun orchestrating a campaign to rehabilitate her reputation that was as sophisticated as any political operation. The narrative she crafted was masterful in its simplicity. I was an unstable woman who had somehow contaminated my own wine to frame her innocent mother-in-law. The medications found in my system? Clearly planted there by someone with access to prescription drugs. Someone like me, who had worked as a pharmacy technician before my marriage. The witness testimony from Nicole? The confused ramblings of a woman who had been drinking heavily and wanted to deflect attention from her own family's problems. It was a desperate strategy, but Rosemarie sold it with the conviction of someone who had spent decades convincing herself that her version of reality was the only one that mattered. And in the insular world of Connecticut high society, where scandal was currency and loyalty was purchased rather than earned, her story began to gain traction. The first sign that her campaign was working came at the grocery store 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. I was picking up essentials when I noticed the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked by, the sideways glances that followed me down the aisles. By the time I reached the checkout, the elderly woman behind me was speaking, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Such a shame about the Whitmore family," she said to her companion, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "To think that poor Rosemarie is being put through this ordeal by someone who would stoop to poisoning herself for attention. Some people will do anything for money, I suppose." The implication was clear. I was a gold digger who had fabricated the entire incident to gain sympathy and perhaps a larger divorce settlement. It was exactly the kind of narrative that Rosemarie's social circle would find believable. The outsider proving her unworthiness through increasingly desperate behavior. But Rosemarie had made one crucial miscalculation in her strategy. She assumed that I would retreat, that the social pressure and public humiliation would force me to drop the charges and disappear quietly from her son's life. She didn't understand that 3 years of her psychological torture had taught me something valuable: how to endure, how to plan, and how to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. The perfect moment came in the form of a phone call from Detective Sarah Chen, the investigator assigned to Rosemarie's case. She had been thorough in her work, interviewing every member of the family multiple times, examining the physical evidence, and building a case that would hold up in court. But she had also discovered something that Rosemarie didn't know I knew about. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Chen said during our meeting at the police station, "we've been going through your mother-in-law's personal effects as part of our investigation. We found something interesting in her bedroom safe." She slid a manila folder across the table toward me. Inside were photocopies of insurance documents, financial records, and what appeared to be correspondence with a private investigator. As I read through the materials, a pattern began to emerge that was far more sinister than simple class prejudice. Rosemarie had been planning this for months, possibly years. The private investigator had been hired to dig into my background, looking for anything that could be used to discredit me or drive me away from her son. The insurance documents showed that she had recently increased Corey's life insurance policy, with herself as the primary beneficiary if something happened to both of us. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails between Rosemarie and someone identified only as MR. The correspondence discussed solving the Jane problem permanently and included detailed discussions about various substances that could cause symptoms that might be attributed to natural causes or accidental poisoning. "We believe MR stands for Dr. Marcus Rothschild," Detective Chen explained. "He's a retired physician who lost his license 5 years ago for prescribing unnecessary medications to elderly patients. He's been living quietly in Rosemarie's circle, and we think he may have been her source for the drugs found in your system." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been a crime of passion or a moment of desperate prejudice. This had been a calculated, premeditated attempt to murder me, planned and executed with the help of a disgraced doctor who had nothing left to lose. But as shocking as the discovery was, it also gave me something I hadn't had before: leverage. Rosemarie's public relations campaign was built on the assumption that she was a victim of false accusations. The evidence Detective Chen had uncovered would destroy that narrative completely and expose her as the calculating killer she truly was. "When will you arrest Dr. Rothschild?" I asked. "We're moving carefully," Detective Chen replied. "We want to make sure we have everything we need before we make our move. But when we do, it's going to be impossible for Rosemarie's lawyers to maintain her innocence." As I left the police station that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Rosemarie thought she was winning this battle through social manipulation and expensive legal representation. She had no idea that her own arrogance and need for control had led her to create a paper trail that would be her downfall. Christmas was still weeks away, but I was already planning the gift I would give the Whitmore family: the complete and utter destruction of their matriarch's carefully constructed facade. The game was entering its final phase, and I was finally ready to play by my own rules. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, 3 weeks before Christmas. I was in my Hartford apartment, going through legal documents with my attorney, when my phone rang. The caller, ID showed Corey's name, but it was his father's voice on the other end. "Jane," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I think it's time we had a family meeting. Rosemarie has some things she'd like to discuss with you." The invitation was phrased as a request, but I could hear the underlying command. After weeks of public humiliation and whispered accusations, Rosemarie was ready to make her final play. She wanted to face me directly, probably believing that her force of personality and decades of social manipulation would be enough to convince me to drop the charges. "When and where?" I asked, keeping my voice equally neutral. "This Saturday evening, 7 o'clock at the house." The house. Not our home or the family estate. Just the house. As if Rosemarie's arrest had somehow stripped the place of its emotional significance. It was a small tell, but it revealed that even her husband was beginning to distance himself from her actions. "I'll be there," I said, and ended the call. My attorney immediately began protesting. Jane, this is a terrible idea. You're talking about confronting someone who tried to kill you, in her own territory, with no witnesses except her family members. What if she tries something again? But I had already made up my mind. Rosemarie had taught me the power of psychological warfare, and now I was going to use those lessons against her. This meeting would be my opportunity to show her that I was no longer the frightened, desperate woman she had tried to eliminate. Saturday evening arrived with a December snowfall that transformed the Connecticut landscape into something from a Christmas card. The Whitmore estate looked particularly imposing in the winter twilight, its Tudor architecture stark against the white-covered grounds. But as I pulled into the circular driveway, I felt none of the old anxiety that had once gripped me when approaching this house. Corey met me at the door, his face drawn and tired. The past few weeks had aged him, and I could see the toll that his mother's actions had taken on him. He had been forced to choose between his wife and his mother, and the weight of that choice was written in every line of his face. "She's in the study," he said quietly. "Dad's there too, and Uncle Pete. Scarlett refused to come." I nodded, unsurprised by his sister's absence. Scarlett had always been Rosemarie's most devoted follower, but even she had limits. Attending a meeting where her mother would have to confront the reality of her crimes was apparently beyond those limits. The study was Rosemarie's second favorite room in the house, after her own bedroom. It was decorated in rich burgundies and golds, with leather-bound books that had probably never been read, and oil paintings of ancestors who had built the Whitmore fortune through various morally questionable means. Rosemarie sat behind the massive mahogany desk like a queen holding court, though her usual imperious confidence was noticeably absent. She looked older than I remembered, her silver hair less perfectly styled, her makeup unable to completely hide the dark circles under her eyes. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll on her as well, but her pale blue eyes still held their calculating intelligence. "Jane," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming." I took the offered seat, noting how the arrangement was clearly meant to establish her dominance. Her behind the desk, me as the supplicant in the smaller chair. It was a classic power play, one I had seen her use countless times with tradespeople and staff members who had displeased her. "I assume you have something you want to say to me?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. Rosemarie folded her hands on the desktop, her wedding ring catching the light from the desk lamp. "I want to make you an offer," she said. "A generous one." She slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside was a check for an amount that made my eyes widen despite my resolve to remain unmoved. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy a house, start a business, live comfortably for years. In exchange for what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You drop the charges against me," Rosemarie said simply. "You admit that you were confused about what happened that night, that you made a mistake in your accusations. You divorce my son quietly, with a generous settlement that will allow you to start fresh somewhere else." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the honeyed tone she used when she was trying to be persuasive. "Think about it, Jane. You could have a completely new life. No more struggling to fit into a world where you don't belong. No more pretending to be something you're not. Just freedom, and enough money to live however you choose." It was a masterful offer, designed to appeal to both my practical nature and my deepest insecurities. Rosemarie was offering me a way out of the legal battle, out of the public scrutiny, out of a marriage that had brought me nothing but pain. All I had to do was admit that she had been right about me all along, that I was nothing more than a grasping outsider who would do anything for money. I looked at the check again, noting the careful way she had written it out in her precise handwriting. Then I looked up at her face, studying the expression of controlled desperation that she was trying so hard to hide. "You're scared," I said quietly. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her composed facade flickered for just a moment, revealing the fear beneath. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "You're scared because you know that Detective Chen found your correspondence with Dr. Rothschild," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You're scared because you know that all your social manipulation and expensive lawyers won't be enough to save you once that evidence becomes public." Rosemarie's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Marcus Rothschild," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "The disgraced doctor who supplied you with the drugs you used to poison me. The one who's going to testify against you in exchange for a reduced sentence on his own charges." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Corey's sharp intake of breath, could see Pete shifting uncomfortably in his chair by the window. Even Rosemarie's husband looked shocked by the revelation. Rosemarie stared at me across the desk, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Recognition. Not just of the facts I had laid out, but of what I had become. I was no longer the weak, desperate woman she had tried to eliminate. I was her equal now, and perhaps something more. "The offer stands," she said finally, but her voice was hollow. I picked up the check and very deliberately tore it in half. Then I tore it again, and again, until the pieces were too small to tear further. I let the fragments fall onto her pristine desk like confetti. "No deal," I said, standing up. "I'll see you in court, Rosemarie." As I walked toward the door, I heard her voice behind me, no longer honeyed but raw with desperation. "You have no idea what you're doing," she called out. "You have no idea what this will cost you." I turned back to look at her one last time. "I know exactly what it will cost," I said, "and I'm willing to pay the price." The confrontation was over, but the war was just beginning. The revelation about Dr. Rothschild's cooperation with the police was only the beginning. 2 days after my confrontation with Rosemarie, Detective Chen called with news that would transform the entire case from a simple attempted murder into something far more complex and sinister. "We need to meet," she said without preamble. "There's been a development in your case that you need to know about." An hour later, I sat across from her in the same sterile interview room where we had met before. But this time the manila folders on the table were thicker, and Detective Chen's expression was grimmer. "Dr. Rothschild has been very cooperative," she began, opening the first folder. "More cooperative than we expected. It turns out that Rosemarie Whitmore wasn't his only client." She spread out a series of photographs and documents that made my blood run cold. Medical records, death certificates, insurance payouts, all connected to elderly patients who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. "We believe your mother-in-law and Dr. Rothschild have been running a murder-for-hire operation," Detective Chen continued, her voice clinical and professional, "targeting wealthy elderly individuals whose deaths would benefit certain family members or associates." I stared at the documents, trying to process what she was telling me. Rosemarie wasn't just a woman who had let class prejudice drive her to attempted murder. She was a serial killer, someone who had turned murder into a business enterprise. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're still investigating, but we have evidence linking them to at least 7 deaths over the past 5 years. All appeared to be natural causes or accidents at the time, but with Dr. Rothschild's testimony and our forensic accounting of Rosemarie's finances, a pattern has emerged." Detective Chen pulled out another folder, this one containing bank records and financial transactions. Rosemarie would identify potential targets, usually through her social connections or charity work. Dr. Rothschild would handle the medical aspects, using his knowledge of drug interactions and dosages to create deaths that appeared natural. They split the profits from insurance payouts, inheritances, or direct payments from grateful beneficiaries. The scope of it was staggering. Rosemarie had weaponized her position in Connecticut society, using her access to wealthy families and her reputation as a pillar of the community to identify victims and gain their trust. She had turned her charity work into a hunting ground. But you weren't supposed to be a victim, Detective Chen continued. According to Dr. Rothschild, you were meant to be a test case. Rosemarie wanted to see if they could successfully eliminate someone younger and healthier without arousing suspicion. If it worked, they planned to expand their operation. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just been the target of Rosemarie's class prejudice. I had been selected as a guinea pig for their murder enterprise. My death was supposed to prove that their methods were sophisticated, enough to work on any target, regardless of age or health status. There's more, Detective Chen said, pulling out yet another folder. We've been monitoring Rosemarie's communications since her arrest. She's been in contact with someone we haven't been able to identify yet. Someone who appears to be helping her coordinate a response to our investigation. She showed me printouts of encrypted messages that had been intercepted from Rosemarie's personal devices. The messages were brief and coded, but their intent was clear. Someone was helping Rosemarie organize a defense that would go far beyond legal representation. We believe she's part of a larger network, Detective Chen explained. Other wealthy individuals who have used similar services or who have knowledge of what she's been doing. They're as invested in protecting her as she is in protecting herself, because her exposure could lead to theirs. The implications were terrifying. Rosemarie wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting to protect an entire network of murderers and conspirators who had been using their wealth and social position to literally get away with murder. What does this mean for my case? I asked. It means the stakes have gotten much higher, Detective Chen replied. Rosemarie is no longer just fighting attempted murder charges. She's facing multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, charges that could put her away for life without the possibility of parole. And that makes her infinitely more dangerous. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Jane, I need you to understand something. You're not just a witness in this case anymore. You're the key to bringing down an entire criminal organization. Rosemarie and her associates will do anything to prevent that from happening. The weight of what she was telling me settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I had thought I was fighting one woman's prejudice and cruelty. Instead, I had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Connecticut society, involving people with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. What kind of protection can you offer me? I asked. We're working on that, Detective Chen said, but her tone wasn't reassuring. The problem is that we don't know who all the players are yet. Rosemarie's network could include police officers, judges, prosecutors, people who could compromise any protection we try to provide. She gathered up the documents and folders, preparing to leave. In the meantime, I need you to be extremely careful. Vary your routines, stay in public places, don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. And if you notice anything unusual, anyone following you, strange phone calls, unexpected visitors, contact me immediately. As I left the police station that afternoon, I felt the weight of eyes watching me from every direction. Parked cars that might contain surveillance teams, pedestrians who seemed to linger too long, windows in nearby buildings that could hide observers. The paranoia was probably irrational, but given what I had just learned, it was also necessary. Rosemarie had taught me to be strategic, to think several moves ahead, to use patience and planning as weapons. Now I would need all of those skills not just to defeat her, but to survive long enough to see justice done. The game had evolved from personal vendetta to something much larger and more dangerous. But I was no longer the naive woman who had walked into the Whitmore estate 3 years ago. I had been forged in the fire of Rosemarie's psychological warfare, and I was ready for whatever came next. The question was whether I was strong enough to bring down an entire network of killers, or whether they would succeed in silencing me first. The first attempt to discredit me came 3 days before Christmas, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike designed to destroy my credibility at the most critical moment in the investigation. I discovered it when I arrived at my Hartford apartment to find my landlord, Mr. Kowalski, waiting in the lobby with an expression of barely contained fury. "I need to talk to you," he said, his Polish accent thicker than usual when he was upset. "About your rent, and about what the police found in your apartment." My blood ran cold. "What police? I haven't authorized any search of my apartment." He pulled out a folded document that looked official, complete with what appeared to be a judge's signature and an embossed seal. "They had a warrant, said they were looking for evidence related to drug trafficking. Found quite a bit, too." The document was a masterpiece of forgery, so convincing that even I had to look twice to spot the subtle inconsistencies that revealed it as fake. The judge's name was real, the case number format was correct, but the signature was slightly off, and the seal was a shade too bright. "Mr. Kowalski," I said carefully, "I need to see my apartment. Now." What I found inside made my stomach turn. Small plastic bags containing white powder had been strategically placed throughout the apartment. In my kitchen drawers, my bedroom closet, even my bathroom medicine cabinet. It was a thorough job, clearly done by professionals who understood how to make drug trafficking charges stick. But there was something else, something that told me this wasn't just about framing me for drug possession. The placement was too obvious, too theatrical. This wasn't meant to fool the police. It was meant to create doubt in the minds of potential jurors, to make them question whether I was really the innocent victim I claimed to be. I called Detective Chen immediately. "Someone's been in my apartment," I said without preamble. "They've planted drugs everywhere, and my landlord has been shown a fake search warrant." "Don't touch anything," she said sharply. "I'm sending a forensics team over now. And Jane? This proves we're on the right track. They're getting desperate." While I waited for the police to arrive, I examined the fake warrant more closely. The forgery was excellent, but not perfect. More importantly, it had been executed with the kind of resources that suggested access to official letterhead, legal knowledge, and professional printing equipment. This wasn't the work of street criminals. This was the work of people with connections in the legal system. The forensics team arrived within an hour, led by Detective Chen and accompanied by 2 officers I didn't recognize. They photographed everything, collected samples of the planted drugs, and dusted for fingerprints on surfaces that the intruders had touched. "Sloppy work," Detective Chen observed as she watched the technicians work. "They wore gloves, but they didn't account for fabric fibers or shoe prints. We'll be able to trace this back to whoever did it. But I was more interested in the fake warrant than the planted evidence." "Who would have access to official court documents?" I asked. "That's what we need to find out," Detective Chen replied. "But the fact that they went to this much trouble tells us we're close to something big. They're trying to destroy your credibility before the trial starts." As if on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar, smooth, cultured, and carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Jane," the voice said, "I think it's time we had a conversation." I recognized the voice immediately. Judge Harrison Blackwood, one of the most respected jurists in Connecticut and a longtime friend of the Whitmore family. He was also, I realized with growing alarm, exactly the kind of person who would have access to official court documents and the resources to create convincing forgeries. "Judge Blackwood," I said carefully, aware that Detective Chen was listening to every word. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I'm sure you weren't," he replied with the kind of paternal condescension that wealthy men used when addressing women they considered beneath their notice. "I understand you've been having some difficulties with your living situation. Drug problems can be so destructive to one's reputation." The threat was elegantly delivered, wrapped in the language of concern, but carrying the unmistakable implication that worse things could happen if I didn't cooperate. Judge Blackwood was showing me exactly how deep Rosemarie's network reached, into the very heart of the legal system that was supposed to protect me. "I don't have drug problems," I said, evenly. "But I do have a problem with people who plant evidence in my apartment." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for me to wonder if I had pushed too hard. Then Judge Blackwood chuckled, a sound like rustling papers. "Such an active imagination," he said. "Though I suppose that's to be expected, from someone under so much stress. The mind can play tricks when faced with serious criminal charges." Detective Chen was frantically scribbling notes, her face grim as she listened to the conversation. She held up a finger, signaling me to keep him talking. "What do you want?" I asked directly. "I want to help you," Judge Blackwood replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "The legal system can be harsh to those who make unsubstantiated accusations against respected members of the community, but it can also be merciful to those who recognize their mistakes and seek to make amends." It was the same offer Rosemarie had made, wrapped in judicial language but carrying the same implicit threat. Admit that I had lied about the poisoning, drop the charges, disappear quietly, and my legal troubles would disappear as well. Refuse, and find myself facing drug trafficking charges that could send me to prison for decades. "And if I don't recognize my mistakes?" I asked. The pause this time was longer, more ominous. "Then I'm afraid your troubles are just beginning," Judge Blackwood said finally. "Good day, Ms. Jane." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in a mixture of anger and fear. Rosemarie's network wasn't just wealthy and well-connected. It included people who could manipulate the very system that was supposed to deliver justice. Detective Chen was already on her radio, calling for backup and requesting surveillance on Judge Blackwood. "We need to move fast," she told me. "If he's willing to make that kind of call, it means they're planning something bigger than just planting drugs in your apartment." As we left my compromised apartment, escorted by a phalanx of police officers, I realized that the game had changed. Once again. This wasn't just about proving Rosemarie's guilt. It was about surviving long enough to see justice done in a system that had been corrupted from within. But I had learned something valuable from Rosemarie's years of psychological warfare. Sometimes the best defense was a strong offense. If they wanted to play dirty, I was ready to show them exactly how much I had learned from their own tactics. The war was far from over, but I was no longer fighting alone. Christmas Eve arrived with unexpected clarity. The call came at dawn from Detective Chen, her voice tight with excitement and urgency. "Jane, we need you at the station immediately. We've had a breakthrough that changes everything." I arrived to find the conference room buzzing with activity. Federal agents in dark suits sat alongside local detectives, their faces grim as they pored over documents spread across multiple tables. At the center of it all was Detective Chen, looking like she hadn't slept in days, but radiating the energy of someone who had finally found the missing piece of a complex puzzle. "Sit down," she said without preamble. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process, but it explains everything that's been happening to you." She pulled out a thick file and opened it to reveal surveillance photographs that made my breath catch. The images showed people I recognized: Judge Blackwood, Rosemarie, Dr. Rothschild, but also faces that were shockingly familiar in ways I hadn't expected. "Agent Sarah Morrison, FBI," said one of the federal agents, extending her hand. "We've been investigating what we call the Heritage Network for 3 years. Your case broke it wide open." The name meant nothing to me, but Agent Morrison's next. Words hit like a physical blow. The Heritage Network is a criminal organization that masquerades as a series of exclusive social clubs and charitable foundations. They provide estate planning services to wealthy families, services that include arranging the convenient deaths of inconvenient relatives. She pointed to one of the surveillance photos. "Your mother-in-law wasn't just a client of this network. She was one of its founding members. And the attempt on your life wasn't personal prejudice. It was a test case for a much larger operation. Detective Chen took over the explanation. 3 years ago, when you married Corey, Rosemarie contacted the Heritage Network with a proposal. She wanted to see if their methods could work on younger, healthier targets who weren't already elderly or infirm. Your marriage made you the perfect test subject. The room seemed to spin around me as the implications sank in. You're saying my entire marriage was orchestrated as part of some kind of murder experiment? Not your marriage, Agent Morrison corrected. But Rosemarie's response to it. She saw an opportunity to advance the network's capabilities while solving what she perceived as a family problem. They spread out more documents, financial records, communication intercepts, membership, lists that read like a who's who of East Coast society. The Heritage Network wasn't just about Rosemarie and Dr. Rothschild. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with members in dozens of wealthy families, all of whom had used the network's services to eliminate inconvenient relatives and claim inheritances. But there's something else, Detective Chen said, her voice taking on a different tone. Someone in your immediate circle has been feeding information to the network about our investigation. She pulled out a series of printed emails and phone transcripts. We've been monitoring all communications related to the case. These intercepts show that someone with access to confidential information about our investigation has been passing details to Rosemarie's associates. My blood ran cold as I read through the communications. Details about my protection arrangements, plans for gathering evidence, even transcripts of conversations I'd had with Detective Chen. All of it had been leaked to the very people who were trying to destroy me. Who? I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Agent Morrison exchanged a glance with Detective Chen before responding. The communications were routed through multiple encrypted servers, but we were able to trace them back to their source. The leaks are coming from someone with legitimate access to the investigation files. She pulled out a photograph that made my heart stop. It showed Corey sitting in what appeared to be a coffee shop, sliding an envelope across a table to a man I didn't recognize. Your husband has been passing information to Heritage Network operatives, Detective Chen said quietly. We believe he's been doing it since the investigation began. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Rosemarie had ever done to me. All those moments when Corey had seemed supportive, when he had appeared to be choosing me over his mother, when I had thought I finally had an ally in the Whitmore family. It had all been an elaborate deception. Why? I managed to ask. Money, Agent Morrison replied bluntly. The Heritage Network offered him $5 million to help discredit you and derail the investigation. They also threatened to expose some unsavory financial dealings he's been involved in if he didn't cooperate. She showed me more documents, evidence of Corey's gambling debts, his involvement in questionable investment schemes, his desperate need for cash that his trust fund couldn't cover. He had been the perfect target for recruitment, compromised, desperate, and with access to exactly the information the network needed. But there's more, Detective Chen continued. Corey isn't the only family member who's been compromised. Pete Whitmore has been a Heritage Network member for over a decade. He's used their services twice, once to arrange his first wife's death, and once to eliminate a business partner who was threatening to expose fraud in their company. The revelations kept coming, each one more shocking than the last. The Whitmore family weren't just wealthy socialites with a problematic matriarch. They were a criminal dynasty that had been using murder as a business tool for years. Nicole knew, I said suddenly, remembering her nervous behavior on Thanksgiving night. She was terrified because she knew what was happening. Nicole has been cooperating with us for weeks, Agent Morrison confirmed. She came forward after the drug planting incident at your apartment. She's been living in fear for years, knowing what her husband was involved in but too afraid to speak up. They showed me transcripts of Nicole's interviews with federal agents. She had provided crucial information about the network's operations, including details about other murders that had been disguised as natural deaths or accidents. "That's how we were able to move so quickly to protect you," Detective Chen explained. "Nicole warned us about Judge Blackwood's involvement and helped us understand the scope of the conspiracy." The scope was staggering. The Heritage Network had members in 12 states, had been responsible for over 50 deaths in the past decade, and had generated millions of dollars in profits from insurance payouts and inheritance manipulation. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we finish what?" "You started," Agent Morrison replied. "We have enough evidence to bring down the entire network, but we need your testimony to make the case stick. You're the one person who survived their attempt, who can speak to their methods and their motives." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "But I won't lie to you. Testifying against this organization will put you in significant danger. They have resources we're still discovering, and they won't hesitate to eliminate threats." I thought about everything I had endured over the past 3 years, all the psychological torture and manipulation I had survived. Rosemarie had unknowingly prepared me for this moment, teaching me how to be patient, how to think strategically, how to survive against overwhelming odds. "When do we start?" I asked. The room erupted in activity as agents and detectives began coordinating the largest organized crime takedown in Connecticut history, but all I could think about was Christmas dinner, and the fact that I finally had the ammunition I needed to destroy not just Rosemarie, but the entire network of killers she represented. The game was about to end, but first I had one final move to make. Christmas Day arrived with an invitation that I had been expecting but dreading. The call came from Corey himself, his voice carrying a forced casualness that I now recognized as calculated manipulation. "Jane," he said, "I know things have been complicated between us lately, but it's Christmas. Mom wants to have the whole family together for dinner. She's been released on bail, and she'd like to clear the air with you." The irony wasn't lost on me. Rosemarie, facing multiple murder charges and knowing that her criminal empire was crumbling around her, wanted to have a family Christmas dinner. But I understood what this really was. A final desperate attempt to control the narrative, to manipulate me one last time before the walls closed in completely. "What time?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. 7 o'clock, Corey replied, and I could hear the relief in his voice that I had agreed. He had no idea that I knew about his betrayal, no idea that every word he spoke was being recorded by the FBI surveillance team monitoring the call. Agent Morrison had briefed me extensively on what to expect. The Heritage Network was in full damage control mode, coordinating a strategy to discredit me before I could testify. This dinner would be their final opportunity to either convince me to recant my testimony or to eliminate me entirely. "You don't have to do this," Detective Chen had told me during our final preparation meeting. "We have enough evidence to prosecute without putting you in harm's way." But I had insisted. Rosemarie had spent 3 years teaching me the power of psychological warfare, showing me how to use patience and strategic thinking as weapons. Now I was going to turn those lessons against her in the most devastating way possible. The Whitmore estate looked different on Christmas evening. The carefully maintained facade of wealth and respectability seemed hollow now, like a movie set designed to hide the rot beneath. But as I walked up to the front door, I felt none of the old anxiety that had once gripped me. Instead, I felt the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards. Corey greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt like Judas betraying Christ. "I'm glad you came," he said. But his eyes were nervous, darting around as if he expected federal agents to emerge from behind the Christmas tree. The dining room had been decorated with Rosemarie's usual attention to detail. Crystal glasses that caught the candlelight, china that had been in the family for generations, silver that gleamed like mirrors. But there was something different about the arrangement this time. The seating had been changed. putting me directly across from Rosemary with my back to the room's main entrance. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to make me feel vulnerable and exposed. Rosemary entered the room like a queen, making her final appearance before abdication. She wore a burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair, and her makeup was flawless despite the stress of the past month. But I could see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands, the tension around her eyes, the way she held herself too rigidly, as if afraid that any relaxation would cause her to crumble entirely. "Jane, darling," she said, her voice carrying the same honeyed tone she had always used. "How lovely that you could join us for Christmas." The others were already seated, Corey's father looking older and more frail than I remembered, Pete avoiding my eyes entirely, and Nicole sitting rigidly beside her husband, her face pale with terror. The twins were notably absent, probably sent away to protect them from whatever was about to unfold. As we sat down to dinner, I noticed the careful choreography of the evening. The servants had been dismissed, unusual for a formal Whitmore dinner. The wine was being poured by Rosemary herself, each glass filled with deliberate precision, and most tellingly, there was a small video camera discreetly positioned to capture my reaction to whatever they had planned. They intended to record my final moments, to create evidence that would support their narrative of my instability and guilt. It was a masterful plan, worthy of the criminal mastermind Rosemary had revealed herself to be. "Before we begin," Rosemary announced, raising her glass, "I'd like to propose a toast. To family, to forgiveness, and to the resolution of past misunderstandings." The others raised their glasses dutifully, but I noticed that Rosemary's eyes never left mine as she spoke. She was watching for any sign of fear, any indication that I understood what was about to happen. Instead, I smiled and raised my own glass. "To truth," I said simply, "and to justice." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Rosemary's composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing the desperation beneath her carefully constructed facade. "Such lovely sentiments," she replied, but her voice carried an edge now. "Though I've always found that truth can be so subjective, particularly when one is under such tremendous stress." She gestured to my wine glass, and I understood that the test had begun. This was her final gambit, to poison me again, but this time in front of the entire family, with cameras recording every moment. She would claim that I had poisoned myself in a desperate attempt to frame her, that my death was the final act of an unstable woman driven to madness by her own lies. I lifted the glass to my lips, aware that every eye in the room was watching my reaction. The wine smelled normal, looked normal, but I knew that appearances could be deceiving. Rosemary had perfected her methods over years of practice, but what she didn't know was that I had perfected my methods too. The wine glass that sat before me wasn't the one she had poured. While she had been making her toast, I had used the distraction to switch glasses with Corey, employing a sleight of hand that would have made a professional magician proud. I took a long, deliberate sip, watching Rosemary's face carefully. For a moment, she looked satisfied, even triumphant. Then confusion began to creep into her expression as I continued drinking without any apparent ill effects. "Delicious wine," I commented, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "What vintage is it?" The question seemed to shake her composure further. She had expected me to start showing symptoms by now, had planned for me to begin the familiar spiral of nausea and disorientation that would prove her narrative of self-poisoning. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small device that made everyone at the table freeze. It was a digital recorder, and the red light indicated that it had been running throughout the entire evening. "I hope you don't mind," I said conversationally, "but I thought it would be nice to record this family Christmas dinner, for posterity." The silence that followed was deafening. Rosemary stared at the recorder as if it were a snake about to strike. while the others exchanged panicked glances. But I wasn't finished yet. The real show was about to begin. The digital recorder sat in, the center of the table like a loaded weapon, its red light pulsing with each passing second. Rosemarie's carefully composed facade was cracking, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she tried to determine how much damage had already been done. "That's quite unnecessary, dear," she said, her voice strained but still attempting to maintain its authoritative tone. "This is a private family dinner. Is it?" I asked, reaching into my purse again. This time I pulled out my phone and placed it beside the recorder. "Because I've been having the most interesting conversations with Detective Chen and Agent Morrison. They've told me the most fascinating things about the Heritage Network." The name hit the table like a bomb. Pete went white as paper. Nicole let out a small whimper, and even Corey's father straightened in his chair with sudden alertness. But it was Rosemarie's reaction that was most telling. Her mask didn't just crack, it shattered completely. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost all its authority. For the first time in 3 years, Rosemarie Whitmore sounded afraid. I smiled, feeling the power shift in the room like a physical sensation. "Don't you? Let me refresh your memory. The Heritage Network, a criminal organization that you helped found. The one that arranges convenient deaths for wealthy families who want to accelerate their inheritance schedules." I pulled up the photos on my phone that Agent Morrison had shared with me, turning the screen so everyone at the table could see. Surveillance photos of Rosemarie meeting with Dr. Rothschild, financial records showing suspicious payments, communication logs that detailed their murder-for-hire operation. 7 deaths over the past 5 years, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. All made to look like natural causes or accidents, all generating substantial profits for the families involved and commission payments for the Heritage Network. Pete tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't support him. "This is insane," he stammered. "Jane, you're having some kind of breakdown." "Am I, Pete?" I interrupted, turning to face him directly. "Is that what you told yourself when you arranged for your first wife's death? Or when you had your business partner eliminated to prevent him from exposing your fraud?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed, without sound, like a fish gasping for air. Nicole, sitting beside him, began to sob quietly. "You've all been so careful," I continued, turning back to Rosemarie. "So methodical, using your social connections to identify targets, your charitable work to gain access to victims, your wealth and influence to cover your tracks. But you made one crucial mistake." Rosemarie leaned forward, her composure completely gone now. "What mistake?" she whispered. "You underestimated me," I said simply. "You thought I was just some weak, desperate woman who would be easy to eliminate. You didn't realize that 3 years of your psychological torture had made me stronger, smarter, more strategic than you ever imagined." I stood up from the table, walking around to where Rosemarie sat. She shrank back from me. This woman who had once terrified me with her casual cruelty. "You used me as a test case," I said, leaning down so that my face was level with hers. "You wanted to see if the Heritage Network's methods could work on younger, healthier targets. But what you didn't anticipate was that I would survive, and once I survived, I would fight back." Rosemarie's hands were shaking now, and I could see tears forming in her pale blue eyes. "Jane, please, we can work this out. Whatever you want." "What I want," I interrupted, "is justice. Not just for me, but for all the people you've killed. Mrs. Henderson, who died so her son could inherit early. Mr. Patterson, whose heart attack was so convenient for his business partners. The Garrett family matriarch, whose sudden stroke saved her children from years of waiting for their inheritance." With each name I spoke, Rosemarie seemed to shrink further into herself. These weren't just business transactions to her anymore. They were real people whose lives she had ended for money. "How do you know these names?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because Dr. Rothschild has been very cooperative," I replied. "He's provided detailed testimony about every operation, every victim, every payment. He's told the FBI everything, Rosemarie, everything." The revelation seemed to break something inside her. She slumped forward, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her burgundy dress suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had ended badly. "Marcus promised me he would never talk," she whispered. "Marcus is facing multiple life sentences," I said coldly. "He chose to save himself rather than protect you. Just like you would have done if the situation were reversed." I walked back to my seat, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I picked up my phone and pressed a button. Immediately, the sound of footsteps could be heard approaching the dining room. "You see, Rosemarie?" I said, watching as federal agents appeared in the doorway. "This dinner was never about clearing the air or having a family Christmas. This was about giving you one final opportunity to confess, to show some remorse for the lives you've destroyed." Agent Morrison entered the room, followed by Detective Chen and several other federal agents. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. "Rosemarie Whitmore," Agent Morrison announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder in the first degree." As the handcuffs clicked around Rosemarie's wrists, she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but something that looked almost like respect. "You've learned well," she said quietly as they led her away. "Perhaps too well." But I wasn't finished yet. As Rosemarie was taken from the room, I turned to face the remaining family members, all of whom were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to terror. "Pete Whitmore," Agent Morrison announced, "you're also under arrest." The room erupted in chaos as more agents moved in to arrest Pete, while Nicole collapsed into hysterical sobs. Corey sat frozen in his chair, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "How could you do this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "These are our families. These are the people who raised us." I looked at my husband, this man who had betrayed me for money, who had sold information about me to the very people trying to kill me, and felt nothing but pity. "These people," I said quietly, "are murderers. And you helped them." As more agents entered the room to take Corey into custody, I realized that my transformation was complete. I was no longer the naive woman who had married into this family hoping for acceptance and love. I was someone else entirely, someone who had survived hell and emerged stronger for it. The game was over, and I had won. But the price of victory was higher than I had ever imagined. In the aftermath of the arrests, as federal agents secured the scene and read rights to the conspirators, I found myself alone in the Whitmore dining room for the first time in 3 years. The Christmas decorations that had once seemed so elegant now looked grotesque in the harsh light of law enforcement flashlights. The family portraits on the walls stared down at me like silent witnesses to the dynasty's fall. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one more revelation I needed to share, one final demonstration of just how completely I had turned their own methods against them. "Agent Morrison," I called out as she supervised Corey's arrest. "There's something else you need to see." She approached me, her expression curious but professional. "What is it, Jane?" I walked over to Rosemarie's carefully positioned video camera, the one she had set up to record what she thought would be my final moments. With deliberate precision, I ejected the memory card and held it up for everyone to see. "This camera has been recording everything," I announced, my voice carrying throughout the room and stopping all conversation. "Every word, every confession, every admission of guilt. Rosemarie thought she was documenting my death, but instead, she documented her own downfall. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the federal agents stopped what they were doing to stare at the small piece of technology in my hand. But that's not all, I continued, walking to the antique sideboard where Rosemarie kept her most prized possessions. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila envelope that I had planted there earlier in the evening, during my carefully orchestrated arrival. Inside this envelope, I said, holding it up for everyone to see, are printed copies of every encrypted communication between Heritage Network members over the past 6 months. Details about planned murders, financial arrangements, target identification protocols, everything. Agent Morrison's eyes widened. How did you get those? I smiled, feeling the full weight of my transformation in that moment. Because I learned from the best teacher possible. Rosemarie spent 3 years showing me how to be patient, how to plan, how to think several moves ahead. She taught me that information is power, and that the most dangerous enemies are the ones you underestimate. I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the mahogany dining table. Names, dates, financial transactions, a complete roadmap of the Heritage Network's operations that would provide prosecutors with everything they needed to dismantle the entire organization. You see, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, while you were all focused on trying to destroy me, I was building a case against you. Every meeting I attended, every conversation I overheard, every seemingly innocent social gathering, I was gathering intelligence. Pete, still in handcuffs but not yet removed from the room, stared at me in horror. That's impossible. You were never privy to network operations. Wasn't I? I asked, turning to face him directly. Did you really think Nicole kept your secrets? Did you believe that your wife, who lived in terror of what you might do to her, would stay silent forever? Nicole looked up at me through her tears, and I saw something that might have been gratitude in her eyes. She had been my inside source for months, feeding me information about Heritage Network operations in exchange for protection for herself and her children. Nicole has been cooperating with federal authorities since October, I revealed. Every network meeting, every planning session, every decision to eliminate a target. She reported it all. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Corey, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. You used her. You manipulated her just like what? I interrupted, my voice cutting through his accusation like a blade. Just like you manipulated me? Just like your mother manipulated everyone around her? The difference, Corey, is that I offered Nicole a way out. I offered her protection, safety for her family, and a chance to stop being complicit in murder. I walked over to where he sat, looking down at this man who had shared my bed while selling information that could have gotten me killed. You, on the other hand, sold me out for money. You betrayed your own wife to protect murderers. The contempt in my voice was unmistakable, and I saw it hit him like a physical blow. Whatever love or loyalty he might have once felt for me was clearly gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. But the most beautiful part of all this, I continued, addressing the room at large, is that Rosemarie created her own destruction. Every lesson she taught me about psychological warfare, every technique she used to try to break me down, every method she employed to maintain control, I absorbed it all and turned it against her. I picked up the wine glass that Corey had unknowingly drunk from, the one that should have contained poison meant for me. Even tonight, her final attempt to eliminate me became the evidence that will convict her. The wine glass she poisoned? It's now evidence of attempted murder. The camera she set up to record my death? It recorded her confession instead. Agent Morrison was already on her radio, coordinating with the forensics team to process all the new evidence I had provided. The scope of the case had expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined, and I was at the center of it all. No longer as a victim, but as the architect of the Heritage Network's destruction. There's one more thing, I said, reaching into my purse one final time. I pulled out a small USB drive and handed it to Agent Morrison. Security footage from every Heritage Network meeting over the past year. Hidden cameras, audio recordings, financial documents, everything you need to prosecute not just the Whitmore family, but every member of the organization. The USB drive represented months of careful planning and strategic thinking. While Rosemarie had been focused on eliminating me, I had been systematically documenting her entire criminal enterprise. As the full scope of my operation became clear, I saw something shift in the expressions of everyone around me. The federal agents looked at me with new respect, recognizing that I had single-handedly provided them with the most comprehensive organized crime case in Connecticut history. But it was the look on Rosemarie's face, as she was led away in handcuffs, that satisfied me most. She finally understood what I had become. Not just a survivor, but a strategist who had outplayed her at her own game. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the reign of the Heritage Network was over. As the last of the conspirators were led away and the evidence was secured, I stood alone in the dining room where my journey had begun. The woman who had entered this house 3 years ago, desperate for acceptance and belonging, was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned that the greatest revenge wasn't destruction, it was transformation. 3 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse in Hartford, watching as the final pieces of the Heritage Network's empire crumbled in real time. The prosecution had been swift and devastating, built on the mountain of evidence I had methodically gathered over the past year. Rosemarie, Pete, Corey, and 17 other network members faced a combined total of over 200 criminal charges. But it was during Rosemarie's testimony that the most shocking revelation emerged, one that I had suspected but never been able to prove until this moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," the prosecutor said, her voice echoing in the packed courtroom, "you've claimed throughout this trial that you were merely a founding member of the Heritage Network, but evidence suggests otherwise, doesn't it?" Rosemarie sat in the witness chair like a broken queen, her silver hair no longer perfectly styled, her expensive suit unable to hide the toll that months in federal custody had taken on her. When she looked up at the prosecutor, I saw something I had never seen before in her pale blue eyes: complete defeat. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, but her voice lacked any conviction. The prosecutor walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit 247, financial records recovered from a Swiss bank account in the defendant's name." As the documents were distributed to the jury, I felt my breath catch. These weren't just records of payments received by Rosemarie for arranging murders. These were records showing payments made to dozens of individuals across multiple states, payments that told the true story of the Heritage Network structure. "Mrs. Whitmore," the prosecutor continued, "these records show that you weren't just a member of the Heritage Network. You were its architect, its CEO, its mastermind. You created this organization from the ground up, recruited its members, and directed its operations for over a decade." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the full scope of Rosemarie's criminal empire became clear. She hadn't just participated in a murder-for-hire scheme. She had invented it, refined it, and turned it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that spanned the East Coast. The Heritage Network generated over $15 million in revenue over 10 years, the prosecutor announced, and according to these financial records, Mrs. Whitmore personally profited to the tune of $8 million from the deaths of at least 37 people. 37. The number hit me like a physical blow. Rosemarie hadn't just tried to kill me. She had successfully murdered 37 other people, turning death into a business model that had made her wealthy beyond imagination. But what shocked me most was her reaction to the revelation. Instead of denial or breakdown, Rosemarie straightened in her chair and smiled. Not the honeyed smile she had always used to manipulate others, but something colder and more genuine. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I built the Heritage Network. I created something beautiful and efficient, a service that wealthy families desperately needed but were too squeamish to arrange themselves. The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even her own defense attorney looked stunned by her sudden confession. I identified a market need, Rosemarie continued, her voice growing stronger. And I filled it. Inconvenient relatives, problematic business partners, obstacles to inheritance. I provided solutions that were clean, untraceable, and profitable for everyone involved. She turned to look directly at me for the first time since the trial began. And I was brilliant at it. The only mistake I ever made was underestimating one small-town girl who turned out to be more like me than I ever imagined. In that moment, I finally understood the full scope of what Rosemarie had created and what I had destroyed. She hadn't just been my tormentor. She had been the criminal mastermind behind a network that had turned murder into a cottage industry for the wealthy elite. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to eliminate me had led to the exposure and destruction of her life's work. The why. Judge called for a recess following Rosemarie's stunning confession, but I knew this wasn't over. As the courtroom emptied, I remained in my seat, watching as federal marshals prepared to escort Rosemarie back to her holding cell. But she had one more move to make. "I'd like to speak with Jane," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise of the departing crowd. "Privately," Agent Morrison immediately protested. "That's not advisable, given—" "I waive any concerns about witness tampering," I interrupted, standing up. "I'll speak with her." 10 minutes later, I sat across from Rosemarie in a sterile conference room, separated by a metal table and the weight of everything that had transpired between us. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and shackles, but her eyes still held that calculating intelligence that had once terrified me. "You destroyed everything," she said without preamble. 15 years of careful construction, gone because of one stubborn girl who refused to know her place. I leaned back in my chair, studying the woman who had tried to kill me. "Is that what you think this was about? My place in your family hierarchy?" Rosemarie laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Wasn't it? You were nothing when Corey brought you home, a pharmacy technician from Hartford with delusions of grandeur. I tried to show you the reality of your situation, but you were too proud to accept it. You tried to murder me because I didn't fit your vision of acceptable breeding. Stock for the Whitmore bloodline," I corrected. "But that was never really about me, was it? It was about control, about maintaining your position as the puppet master pulling everyone's strings." Her expression shifted, becoming more thoughtful. "You understand me better than I expected. Yes, it was about control. The Heritage Network was my masterpiece, a perfect system for eliminating problems while generating substantial profits. You threatened that system." "I threatened you," I said simply, "because for the first time in decades you encountered someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated." Rosemarie leaned forward, her shackles clinking against the metal table. "Do you know what the most frustrating part of all this has been? Watching you become everything I always hoped Scarlett would be. Intelligent, strategic, ruthless when necessary. You could have been my successor." The revelation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Your successor? In running a murder-for-hire operation?" "In understanding that power is the only currency that matters," she replied. "Money, social position, even family connections. They're all just tools for acquiring and maintaining power. You learned that lesson better than anyone." I studied her face, looking for any sign of remorse or regret. What I found instead was admiration, twisted and self-serving, but genuine nonetheless. "I'm not you, Rosemarie," I said quietly. "I didn't destroy your network to build my own criminal empire. I did it because 37 people deserve justice." "Justice," she repeated, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. How disappointingly naive. "You had the opportunity to take control of everything I built, to step into a position of real power, and instead you handed it all over to the authorities. She shook her head, her expression almost pitying. You could have been a queen. Jane? Instead, you chose to be a witness. I stood up, preparing to leave. You still don't understand, do you? I never wanted to be you. I wanted to stop you. As I reached the door, Rosemarie's voice stopped me one final time. This isn't over, she said, her tone carrying the same authority. It always had. The Heritage Network was bigger than just me. There are others, other operations, other masterminds. You've won this battle, but the war continues. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had shaped me in ways I was still discovering. Then I guess I'll have to win that war too. The smile that crossed her face was genuine for the first time since I'd known her. There's my protégé, she said softly. I knew you had it in you. 2 weeks later, the verdicts came down like hammer blows. Rosemarie Whitmore. Guilty on all counts, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Pete Whitmore. Guilty of conspiracy and multiple counts of murder, sentenced to death. Corey. Guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The Heritage Network was officially dead, its assets seized, its members scattered to prisons across the country. But I felt no satisfaction in the victory, only a hollow sense of completion, like finishing a book I had never wanted to read. The media called it the Connecticut murder ring, and painted me as a heroic whistleblower who had brought down a criminal empire. The truth was more complicated. I had been transformed by this experience in ways that made me question who I really was now. 3 days after the sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor at my new apartment in Boston. Nicole stood at my door, looking healthier than I had seen her in years. Her children flanked beside her like small shadows. I wanted to thank you, she said simply, and to apologize. I invited them in, noting how the twins had grown in the months since the arrests. They looked like normal children now, not the nervous, watchful creatures they had been in the Whitmore house. You saved our lives, Nicole continued once we were seated. I know what Pete would have done to us eventually. The network didn't tolerate loose ends. You saved your own lives, I corrected, when you chose to tell the truth instead of protecting him. She shook her head. I was too afraid to act on my own. You gave me the courage to fight back. She paused, studying my face. But you look tired, Jane. Like you're carrying something. Heavy. She was right. The weight of 37 deaths, of a criminal empire built on the bones of inconvenient people, pressed down on me every day. I had won, but the cost of victory was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Rosemarie was right about one thing, I admitted. This experience changed me. I'm not sure I like who I've become. Nicole leaned forward, her expression earnest. You became someone who could survive her, someone who could stop her. That's not something to regret. After they left, I sat alone in my apartment, contemplating the strange turn my life had taken. I had started this journey as a desperate woman seeking acceptance from a family that would never embrace me. I was ending it as someone who had systematically destroyed that same family. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Agent Morrison's voice was crisp and professional. Jane, we've had a development. We've identified 3 other networks operating along the East Coast, all apparently inspired by Rosemarie's model. We could use your help. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of decision. Rosemarie had been right. This war was far from over. There were other masterminds out there, other networks of wealthy killers who believed murder was just another business transaction. What do you need me to do? I asked. We need someone who understands how these people think, Agent Morrison replied. Someone who can get inside their organizations and gather intelligence. Someone they would never suspect. It was both an opportunity and a trap. I could continue Rosemary's work in reverse. Instead of facilitating murder, I would be preventing it. But I would also be stepping deeper into a world of deception and manipulation that had already changed me in fundamental ways. "I'll think about it," I said, though we both knew I had already made my decision. After hanging up, I walked to my bathroom mirror and stared at the woman looking back at me. She had Rosemary's calculating eyes now, the same predatory intelligence that missed nothing and trusted no one. The student had indeed surpassed the teacher. The question was whether that was a victory or a defeat. 1 year later, I stood in the dining room of another grand estate, this one in the Hamptons, watching another family of wealthy socialites gather for what they believed would be a private discussion about eliminating an inconvenient relative. They had no idea that the elegant woman in the designer dress, the one they had welcomed into their circle as a potential client, was recording every word. My name was Elizabeth Sterling. Now, my backstory carefully crafted by federal authorities. Widowed heiress with a problematic stepson who stood to inherit her late husband's fortune. I had approached the Meridian Group, one of the Heritage Network's successor organizations, 6 months ago, playing the role of a desperate woman seeking their particular brand of problem-solving. "The beauty of our service," the matriarch was explaining, her voice carrying the same cultured authority that Rosemary had perfected, "is that everything appears completely natural. A tragic accident, a sudden illness, an unfortunate overdose. The authorities never suspect foul play." I nodded along, playing my part while the hidden cameras captured every moment. The FBI would have everything they needed to dismantle this operation, just as they had the previous 2 networks I had infiltrated over the past year. But something had changed in me during these months of deception. The line between Jane the bribe victim and Jane the hunter had blurred beyond recognition. I found myself genuinely enjoying the chess game, the careful manipulation, the moment when my targets realized they had been outplayed. Rosemary's voice echoed in my memory. "You could have been a queen." The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of discretion. As I prepared to leave, knowing that federal agents would move in within hours to make arrests, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror by the door. The woman staring back at me was poised, confident, and utterly in control. She bore little resemblance to the pharmacy technician who had married into the Whitmore family 4 years ago. That woman had been desperate for acceptance, willing to endure any humiliation for the promise of belonging. This woman belonged nowhere and everywhere. She was whoever she needed to be to get the job done. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Morrison. "Excellent work. We have everything we need. 3 more organizations have been identified. Are you ready for the next assignment?" I looked around the opulent dining room one last time, thinking about all the similar rooms I had sat in over the past year, listening to wealthy people casually discuss murder as if it were a real estate transaction. Rosemary had been right about the war continuing. But she had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't chosen to be merely a witness. I had become something far more dangerous, a predator who hunted other predators. I typed back a single word. Yes. As I walked away from the estate, I wondered if Rosemary would be proud of what I had become, or if she would recognize the monster she had created. Perhaps both. The game continued, but now I was the one writing the rules. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.